Welcome to the Deep Dive, the shortcut to understanding the complex world around us. So today we are taking a massive leap. We're going way back in time, but also zooming way in to look at the organisms that really form the foundation of, well, all life on Earth, prokaryotes. And to really get us started, I want you to just picture something that almost defies logic. Imagine you're standing next to a lake in Spain, but the water, it's not blue, it's this brilliant, almost shocking pink. And that color comes from trillions and trillions of prokaryotes, specifically archaea, that are just thriving in this incredibly salty water. I mean, it's an environment that would kill almost anything else.
That image it perfectly sets the tone. We're talking about the domains bacteria and archaea, and they are by far the most abundant organisms on the planet.
The scale is just mind-boggling.
It is. And because their populations are so enormous, they have this shocking ability for rapid evolution, for incredible diversity. So our mission today, our deep dive, is to really understand their core adaptations, their structure, how they share genes, their metabolism, and how all of that lets these microscopic giants really run the planet.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Let's start with their structure. I mean, we're talking about cells that are typically tiny, right? Maybe 0.5 to 5 micrometers.
Very small.
And by definition, they seem simple. They're unicellular. They don't have all those complex membrane-bound organelles like a nucleus or mitochondria that, our cells have. But simple doesn't mean primitive.
Absolutely not. I mean, their main structural defense is the cell wall. Think of it as armor. It gives them their shape, it protects them, and it keeps them from bursting from osmotic pressure.
And that cell wall is the first big clue that we're dealing with two very different groups.
Exactly. The cell wall immediately tells you the difference between the two domains. Bacteria use a unique polymer. It's called peptidoglycan. It's the sort of mesh of sugars and polypeptides. But archaea, they completely lack peptidoglycan. They use totally different proteins or polysaccharides.
And that difference, that peptidoglycan, is what allows us to do that classic lab test, the Gram stain.
Yeah.
So what is that test actually telling us about the cell's architecture?
It's basically telling us if the armor is thick and exposed, or if it's thinner and has an extra layer of protection. So the test divides bacteria into two big groups. You have gram-positive bacteria.
Okay.
They have a really simple wall with a very thick exposed layer of peptidoglycan. And so they soak up that first purple dye and they stay in dark.
Right.
But gram-negative bacteria are more complex. They have a thin peptidoglycan layer, but it's sandwiched between the plasma membrane and another protective outer membrane.
Ah, so it's hidden.
It's hidden.
Yeah.
And that outer membrane blocks the dye, so they end up staining a lighter pink or red.
And the really critical thing for you to remember here is the practical implication of that difference.
Precisely. The gram-negative bacteria are often more dangerous. That protective outer membrane makes them so much harder to kill because it blocks access for antibiotics like penicillin, which are designed to attack that exposed peptidoglycan.
So that one structural difference has basically shaped how we've fought bacterial infections for decades.
It has. And moving beyond the wall, they have other layers. Some of them have this sticky coat of protein or polysaccharide. If it's dense, we call it a capsule. If it's a bit looser, it's a slime layer.
And what's that for?
It's crucial for sticking to things, sticking to your teeth or sticking to other cells to form a colony. And for a pathogen, that capsule is like an invisibility cloak. It helps them hide from the host's immune system.
Wow. And what about when conditions get really bad? When survival seems impossible?
Well, then some of them, like the bacterium that causes anthrax, deploy this terrifying mechanism, the endospore.
Endospores are just incredible. They're basically these ultra-resistant survival pods.
That's a great way to put it. The cell makes a copy of its chromosome, surrounds it with this incredibly tough dehydrated coat, and just shuts down, halts metabolism completely.
And they can survive boiling water, radiation. They can stay dormant for hundreds of years just waiting for things to get better.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine a tougher survival plan.
It really is. Now, for movement, about half of all prokaryotes can move with purpose. We call it taxis. And if they're moving towards food or away from a toxin, that's chemotaxis.
So how do they manage that? I mean, no muscles, no nerves. They use the flagellum, but it's nothing like the flagellum on, say, a eukaryotic sperm cell.
No, completely different. It's a fantastic example of analogous structures of convergent evolution. The prokaryotic flagellum is, it's more like a molecular turbine, a tiny outboard motor.
A motor? How does that work?
Well, their metabolism pumps protons out of the cell, creating a gradient. And the flow of those protons back into the cell through those protein rings in the membrane provides the energy to spin the filament like a propeller. It's just pure biomechanical elegance.
That is amazing. Okay, so last piece of structure.
Mm,
Their DNA. Their blueprints. Unlike us, it's usually just a single circular chromosome.
right. And it's located in a region called the nucleoid. There's no nuclear membrane boxing it in.
Yeah.
And then you have these crucial little rings of extra DNA called plasmids.
And those plasmids, as we'll see, are the key to their entire evolutionary engine, which I think leads us right into our next section, how these tiny, simple cells create such stunning diversity.
It does.
So section 2, the engine of diversity. Prokaryotes don't reproduce sexually. They use binary fission, where one cell just splits into two. And sometimes that can happen every 20 minutes.
And that speed, that scale, that's everything. The actual mutation rate for any single gene is low, maybe 1 in 10 million cell divisions. But when you have trillions of cells dividing that fast,
Mutations pile up instantly.
instantly, the insight here is huge. These populations are evolving in real time. I mean, if you look at E. coli in a human gut, we think that population generates over 8 million new mutations every single day.
That's incredible. So beyond just random mutation, their genetic material is sort of open source. They can share genes through what's called a horizontal gene transfer.
Exactly. It's recombination without sex. And there are 3 main ways they do it. First is transformation.
Okay.
This is just picking up naked foreign DNA from the environment. So if a cell dies and bursts, releasing a piece of DNA that has, say, a virulence gene, a harmless neighbor can slurp that up, integrate it, and suddenly become a pathogen.
Wow. Okay, what's the second way?
The second is transduction. This is when viruses get involved, phages, they're viruses that infect bacteria. They can accidentally package up a piece of the host cell's DNA when they're replicating.
I see.
So when that virus goes and infects a new cell, it injects the DNA from the previous host, and that can get incorporated.
Kind of accidental gene delivery service.
Precisely. And the third method is conjugation. This is the most direct. This is when 2 cells physically connect with a little tube, a pilus, and one cell passes DNA to the other.
Like a mating bridge.
Essentially, yes, and it's all governed by something called the F factor, or the fertility factor. If the F factor is on one of those little plasmids we mentioned, an F plasmid, the donor cell can just transfer a copy of that plasmid to the recipient.
And now the recipient can be a donor too.
Exactly. But if the F factor gets integrated into the cell's main chromosome, that cell becomes what we call an HFR cell. And when it conjugates, it tries to transfer its whole chromosome, pulling its own genes along with it.
So it's a full-blown genetic merger.
It leads to a truly recombinant cell.
Yeah.
And this mechanism, conjugation, it has terrifying implications for public health because of our plasmids.
R for resistance.
R for resistance.
Yeah.
These are plasmids that carry genes for antibiotic resistance. And because they often have the genes for making a pilus, they can spread that resistance through a population, and even to different species, with incredible speed. This is the engine of the multi-drug resistance crisis.
That terrifying efficiency. It just underpins everything. And that includes their metabolic diversity. I mean, if we look at the 4 major ways organisms get energy and carbon, prokaryotes are the only ones that cover all 4.
Yeah, their flexibility is amazing. You have the ones we know, the photoautotrophs, using light and CO2.
Like cyanobacteria?
Right. But then you get these 2 modes that are totally unique to prokaryotes. Chemoautotrophs, which get energy from inorganic chemicals like ammonia or hydrogen sulfide, and photoheterotrophs, which use light for energy but need organic compounds for their carbon.
And of course, there are the chemoheterotrophs, which are like us needing organic compounds for both energy and carbon. Their relationship with oxygen is just as varied.
It is. You have your obligate aerobes that have to have oxygen, and then you have obligate anaerobes, which are actually poisoned by it.
So they live by fermentation or anaerobic respiration?
Exactly. And then you have the really adaptable ones, the facultative anaerobes who can switch. They'll use oxygen if it's there, but they can survive just fine without it.
And one of their most critical jobs for the whole planet is nitrogen fixation.
Absolutely vital. Taking inert nitrogen gas from the atmosphere, N2, and converting it into ammonia, NH3, which is a form that all life can use to build proteins and nucleic acids. No eukaryote can do this.
And this incredible chemistry sometimes requires cooperation.
Yes, a great example is the cyanobacterium anabaena. It forms these long filaments of cells. Now, photosynthesis produces oxygen, but oxygen inactivates the enzymes needed for nitrogen fixation.
So they have a conflict.
A major conflict. So they specialize. Some cells in the chain just do photosynthesis, but others become these specialized, thick-walled cells called heterocysts. Their only job is to fix nitrogen, and their thick wall keeps the oxygen out. Then they share the nitrogen and the sugars up and down the chain.
That kind of cooperation also happens on a massive scale in biofilms.
Yes, biofilms. Those are those sticky surface coating colonies. You see them everywhere, from
Oh.
slime on a river rock to the plaque on your teeth.
They can be a huge problem in medicine.
A huge problem. The cells secrete this massive matrix of proteins and polysaccharides that protects them from antibiotics, from the immune system. It makes chronic infections incredibly hard to treat.
So let's pull back to the big picture, the actual domains. We're finding out there are way more prokaryotes than we ever imagined.
Oh, absolutely. Metagenomics, where we just sequence DNA from the environment, has shattered our old ideas. We've named maybe 16,000 species, but estimates suggest there could be millions.
And their family tree is complicated because of that horizontal gene transfer we talked about.
Really blurs the lines. But the two great domains remain clear: bacteria and archaea.
So in the domain bacteria, what are the big groups we should know?
Well, there's the proteobacteria. They're just spectacularly diverse. They include pathogens like the one that causes cholera, but also, and this is critical, the ancestor of our mitochondria.
The powerhouses of our cells.
That's right. Then you have the cyanobacteria, the photoautotrophs that first pumped oxygen into Earth's atmosphere and became the ancestors of all plant chloroplasts. And then there's the gram-positive bacteria, just as diverse, giving us many of our antibiotics, but also some of our worst pathogens like MRSA.
Okay, now for the other domain, archaea. For a long time, we mainly knew them as extremophiles.
Right, organisms that just love conditions that would kill anything else. You have the extreme halophiles, like the ones in that pink lake we started with. They have to live in super high salt.
And the extreme thermophiles.
The heat lovers, they thrive in boiling water, in volcanic springs. Their DNA and proteins have special adaptations to stay stable at those temperatures. In fact, we use their DNA polymerases in labs for PCR all the time.
And let's not forget the methanogens.
A fascinating group. They're strict anaerobes that produce methane as a waste product. You find them in swamps, in the guts of cattle and termites. They're major players in the carbon cycle.
And recently, the phylogeny of archaea has gotten really exciting.
It really has. There's this supergroup of archaea called TAC, and within that group, scientists have discovered the Lokiarchaeotes.
Lokiarchaeotes, why are they so important?
Because genetic analysis shows they have a number of genes that were previously thought to be exclusive to eukaryotes.
To us.
To us. Genes involved in complex things like remodeling membranes and moving vesicles around. This suggests they represent a kind of intermediate step, that they could be the long-sought-after sister group to all eukaryotes.
That's a huge deal, a direct link, potentially.
It's a very powerful idea.
Okay, so that's who they are. Let's pivot to what they do, their crucial roles on the planet.
Well, first and foremost, they are the planet's ultimate recyclers. Chemoheterotrophic prokaryotes are the decomposers. They break down all the dead organic material and waste, and they release elements like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus back into the environment. Without them, ecosystems would just grind to a halt.
Nutrients would be locked up forever.
Forever. And their interactions with other life forms, the symbiosis, is constant. You have mutualism, where both benefit, like the bacteria in our gut helping us digest food.
You have commensalism, where one benefits and the other is unharmed, like most bacteria on our skin.
And of course, parasitism, where the pathogen harms the host. A really dramatic example of their importance is at deep-sea hydrothermal vents. There's no sunlight, so the entire food web is powered by chemoautotrophic prokaryotes harvesting chemical energy from the vents.
Okay, so let's bring it right home to our direct human interactions.
Yeah.
Beyond our gut bacteria, we use them all the time in industry.
Oh, all the time. For making cheese, yogurt. But the biggest leap has been in biotechnology.
Right.
They are the workhorses for gene cloning, for producing pharmaceuticals, hormones, vitamins, and of course they gave us the CRISPR-Cas9 system.
The revolutionary gene editing tool.
The one that has completely changed biology. And it came from a bacterial immune system. We also use them for bioremediation, basically, using them to clean up our messes, like oil spills, sewage, even radioactive waste.
But we have to face the negative side. Pathogens. Bacteria cause about half of all human diseases, and they generally use one of two types of poison.
They do. They use either exotoxins, which are proteins they actively secrete. Think of the cholera toxin or the botulinum toxin.
Or they use endotoxins.
Right. Endotoxins are components of the outer membrane of gram-negative bacteria. They're only released when the bacteria die and fall apart, and that's what causes things like fever and shock in infections like salmonella.
And as we've said, a harmless strain of, say, E. coli can become deadly just by picking up the genes for these toxins through horizontal gene transfer.
Which brings us back full circle to the antibiotic resistance crisis. It's driven by their rapid reproduction and the rampant spread of those R plasmids through conjugation. Resistance has evolved to every single drug we've ever made.
And we're now seeing strains like XDR-TB and MRSA that are resistant to multiple drugs, and they pose a genuine threat to global health security.
It's a dark picture, but, research is always offering new hope. We're finding new classes of antibiotics, like melacidins, that seem to work against these resistant strains. It reminds us that the bacteria themselves might hold the solutions to the problems they create.
So to wrap up this dive,
Yeah.
the incredible success of prokaryotes really comes down to their structure, that tough cell wall, those endospores, their speed and scale, binary fission and mutation, and their just unbelievable metabolic flexibility.
They cover every energy and carbon source possible. They drive global chemical cycles. They're at the foundation of every ecosystem, and they influence everything from our food to our health.
It's stunning. 2 of the 3 great domains of life are these single-celled organisms, and one of them, Archaea, and specifically those loci-archaeotes we mentioned, seems to be the direct ancestor of the 3rd domain, eukarya, our domain.
That's the current thinking.
So it leaves you with this final huge question to think about. We know those ancient archaea were right on the cusp of complexity. So what was it? What was that one specific structural or metabolic innovation that allowed for that monumental leap? The one that led to internal membranes, to organelles, and eventually to the rise of all complex life, including us.
That remains one of the deepest questions in all of biology. A profound thought to leave you with.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see
Yeah.
you next time.